Hi, David.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcast. And you're David Frum.
Yes.
What is it, senior editor at The Atlantic?
Yes, that's right. That doesn't refer to grandeur, just to decrepitude.
I see. Well, that explains it. I mean, in the cases when I've had that title, which I've had at a number of publications, but no longer have. Anyway, this is neither here nor there. You've also written a lot of books. Everyone knows you. You're very well known, but you've written a book called Trumpocracy, which I've been listening to the audiobook, so I don't have an actual book to hold up, but the audiobook looks like that, which is remarkably like what the book looks like. The Corruption of the American Republic. Probably everyone in the viewing and listening audience has heard of Donald Trump. He needs no introduction. I think the title and subtitle suggest that you're not a big fan, although, of course, you are, historically conservative. So you were among the Never Trump conservatives, and unlike some of them, you remain Never Trump.
Well, I never used the term Never Trump because when that term originated, it was a time when I was I described myself as Trump curious in 2015 because I thought he could. The Never Trump group were people who assailed Donald Trump for not being pure enough in his conservative ideology, and that they staked out an interesting position where they attacked Trump, I guess, from the ideological right or from the point of view of ideological consistency. I thought what was interesting about him in 2015 was that he was shaking up some ideological rigidity that needed to be shaken up. I mean, it never occurred to me that he would actually prevail and get the nomination, but I thought he could do some useful service.
Mm-hmm. But by the election, you were firmly anti-Trump.
Yeah, but by the spring of 2016, when I was, then the whole thing took on this nightmare quality because I found myself in the situation where, having been curious about him, could he shake up the party, put some ideas in motion that some more responsible actor would steal? Instead, the party responded to him by remaining every bit as ideologically rigid as ever, and yet yielding to him.
Now, was the main issue on which you thought he could be useful immigration?
Immigration is part of a cluster of issues. I thought he could be useful on getting the party to understand that the social insurance state is here to stay.
Uh-huh.
Unlike your friend and sparring partner, Mickey, for me, immigration is part of a cluster of issues having to do with building a stronger national safety net on the basis of a stronger sense of national identity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Mickey would be fine with the safety net, I think. I mean, that's a liberal sounding idea.
Right. So my joke that sort of summed this up is that the Republican rank and file were signaling was that they wanted more Medicare, less immigration, and no more Bushes. And the party offered them less Medicare, more immigration, and one more Bush. And that was the gap into which Donald Trump stepped.
So in a certain sense, I mean, in some ways, he has kind of held the line from your point of view on immigration, I guess, at least in a broad sense. But in some ways...
No, not at all.
You don't agree?
I don't agree. I don't see him as an immigration success story. Because Donald Trump doesn't understand or care about building national consensus. That the point to a more restrictive immigration policy would have a couple of goals in mind. One is tightening the labor market to drive up wages, and the second is helping Americans to arrive at a stronger sense of national cohesion. So they're more willing to make sacrifices one for another, and so it's harder to pit them against each other. So in order to do that, the immigration message has to be a very inclusive one. What Trump has consistently done is, while showing very little interest in what I think is properly goal one, which is reducing overall numbers and enforcing illegality, he's approaches it in the most provocative possible way, in a way that has clearly identified the immigration cause with a kind of ethnic chauvinism that can't and won't and shouldn't work in America. And as a result, he's going to take down the immigration issue with him. So he will be able to do some kind of bloody-minded enforcement for however long he controls the federal bureaucracy. But we're not going to see some lasting legal change. And the next president, of course, is going to recoil in the opposite direction.
Okay, so is your issue with his rhetorical tone on immigration, or are the actual policies he's proposing in some ways more divisive than you'd like?
Yeah, the goal with immigration has always been to focus on the future growth and the future growth of the immigration numbers, the future control of illegality, rather than by harassing the most sympathetic cases of those who are already in the country. And the Trump method, because, and maybe this is just the broken telephone of communicating through bureaucratic agencies, is I think every time that they pounce on somebody who's been in the country for 20 years and rip him from his family and kick him across the border, that you are damaging the politics of immigration, not helping.
Yeah, this is actually what I've said to Mickey, is it's a little bit ironic to me that there's been so much focus on the wall from the left. I mean, because to me, you know, border security per se, I don't have a problem with. I think the wall's kind of an unfortunate metaphor and not a very cost-effective way of getting it. But that aside, what I have deep objection to is the inhumanity of making everyone who's already here live in fear. So it sounds like you and I, although I mean I'm not actively pro-restriction, it sounds like you and I are somewhat on the same page there.
If by the wall you mean satellites and drones, then I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. And I'm sure you don't mean armed drones. You mean surveillance drones.
Yeah. But if it means pouring concrete into marshes, and purchasing scrubland, hundreds of thousands of acres from it, and giving a payday to their landowners, I don't see a lot of point to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like, you know, in some ways you wish Trump had been, and I know you'll want to carefully define the sense in which this is true, if you acknowledge its truth at all, but in some ways you wish he had been a little more Bannonite, in the sense that, I mean, Bannon would be more left on, you know, some domestic policy issues, more in the way of safety net, less in the way of tax cuts for the rich, and so on, right?
Well, do you know the story of the Plotkin diamond?
It sounds familiar. You may have told me on this very forum, but
so the Plotkin diamond is a legendary stone. It's a magnificent stone, and it's fabled in history. It's been owned by empresses and countesses and nieces of popes, and today and it is now present inside the United States. And there's a woman who owns it, but you know, like all great stones, it comes both of these legendary stories, but the Plotkin diamond also comes with a terrible curse. And the terrible curse is Mr. Plotkin.
Right. So I'm right, basically, right?
Well, no, the point is when you say you want him to be more Bannonite, what does that mean? I mean, Steve, there is no sense in which Steve Bannon is a man of ideas. He's a man of impulses and brutality, and who has put himself at the service of Donald Trump for reasons of his own. I mean, look, it didn't take Trump and Bannon to say that the United States has a crisis in its middle class population. It's got a drug crisis. It's got a crisis of national cohesion. But maybe put it this way. Here's a better way to put it. About a month and a half before the election, the national election, I was in contact with a friend of mine who was in the orbit of the Trump world. And he said, I don't understand why you talk about Trump the way you do. Because, as you just said, I mean, you're sympathetic to many of the things that he's talking about. So, you know, why aren't you on board the Trump train? And I said to him, look, the reason I've been talking about these issues dating back to 2007 was in order to stop people like Donald Trump. I foresaw that they were coming, and it was to cut them off. It's to say, well, you can, you know, having failed to prevent the crisis, now that the crisis is here, because you cared about the conditions that enabled the crisis, therefore you should sign up for it. No, the whole point of having a more cohesive society is to keep characters like Trump and Bannon away from state power.
Right. So you wanted some of the issues embraced by Trump, certainly during the campaign, and Bannon, without the authoritarian overtones, without the overtones of bigotry, and so on.
Not the supposing I said this to you, Bob. Bob, you're a pretty liberal guy. You're in favor of you probably would like to see a more expansive social welfare state. You probably would like to see more redistribution. You probably would like to see more efforts to smooth out the booms and busts of the national economy. You'd surely like more regulation of finance. There's this guy called V.I. Lenin who's plotting an armed takeover of the United States government. Why aren't you with him? Because he's talking about many of the same things that you are.
Actually, an armed takeover sounds better since November 2016 than it would have before. But aside from that, I take your point. And I'm joking, of course, about the armed takeover.
But the point is that the reason that what was so dangerous about where we were before this election was in the United States and around the world that you could see a reaction building to, slow growth, high inequality, at too rapid a pace of demographic change, the alienation of people from their government, the particular problems of the baby boom generation reaching retirement age without as much savings as they thought they would have back in 1998. You could see all of this was heading toward trouble. And the wise statesmanship, especially wise conservative statesmanship, would try to intervene to head the trouble off. And instead, it has submitted to the trouble and is now enabling the trouble.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the way to ask the question without referring to Bannon would have been this. The way Trump was talking as a candidate, I was thinking he could wind up being a figure who would lead to an actual party realignment in a very substantial way, because he was embracing some issues that Democrats have traditionally held up. Mm-hmm. In other words, it sounded like more of a left-wing populism than it has turned out to be. And part of that was shared by Bannon, and that's all I meant by that. But then he comes into office, very conventional Republican tax cut, sure, a little bit for middle-income people, but really just your ship has come in if you're rich, and in various other ways. He's not exactly as advertised in the campaign.
Well, I think we are going to see substantial change in the party system, and if Trump is politically successful, and no one should assume there isn't a second term. I mean,
I agree.
Of presidents since the war, only 3 failed to get a second term who wanted it, depending on how you count, maybe arguably Lyndon Johnson. But it takes a lot to be deprived of a president of a second term. Johnson had Vietnam. Carter had so many catastrophes on his hands. And George H.W. Bush had a party fracture over the tax issue plus a recession. It takes a lot. So if you imagine a successful Trump presidency or a politically successful one, I think the party system is changing, and I think it's been changing before our eyes. I mean, what you have seen are an exit of professionals, especially women, out of the Republican Party. I think that will only continue, and it will spread from places where we're used to it happening, like the coasts and the knowledge centers. It'll spread. I wonder how many. A figure I use in the book is in the state of Pennsylvania in 2016. Both Trump and Pat Toomey, the more conventional Republican candidate for U.S. Senate, got 1.2 million votes, but Trump ran 200,000 votes behind Toomey in the Philadelphia suburbs, and 200,000 votes ahead of Toomey in the rest of the state. Mm-hmm. Those 200,000 people who voted for Toomey, not Trump. What happens to them? I assume they're better educated, more affluent, probably more female. I assume that they are on their way out. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is building a new ethno-nationalist future for the Republican Party that has power, has authentic power.
Mm-hmm. So you, just quickly, what are the other issues? You said since 2007 you've been championing some movement among conservatives on certain issues, including immigration, in hopes of heading off a figure like Trump. Yeah. Just quickly again, what are the other ones that you've been embracing?
Well, I've been very worried. In 2007, the opioid epidemic was not visible, but you could already see. I wrote a book about this in 2007, which you were one of like 3 people interested enough to talk to. I thank you for that. But I talked then about the rise in drug use that was observable among people, men especially in their 20s. And in those days, the drug was marijuana, but it was clearly we were seeing a turn to drug dependency that intensified after the recession. I've been very, very worried about health outcomes. We are seeing this collapse of longevity among non-college Americans, especially non-college white Americans, This didn't happen, by the way, during the Great Depression. During the Depression, life expectancy improved. And we have all kinds of, and cite mental health problems. We have indications that more Americans are lonely, more Americans are socially isolated. So these are the things that worry me. And there's a limit to what public policy can do about any of these problems. But even simply identifying them as problems even is helpful, even if you don't have a solution yet. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not obvious to me what the right answer is to opioids, for example, but simply noticing that it's there. The life expectancy problem, not obvious what to do about it. Noticing it's there. I note things like Americans are significantly less likely to wear seatbelts than are people in other developed countries. It's still very high, by the way. If I remember it right, and I may not have the numbers at my fingertips, I think it's like 86% of Americans and 92% of everybody else. Okay, so 86% is pretty high. It's probably quite difficult to get from 86 to 92, but other people, the British and the Germans, are somehow able to do it.
And you're saying that's symptomatic of something?
It's symptomatic of, I mean, I don't want to get all new age. Oh, if I can go new agey with anybody, I can do it with you. But
not true. That is a stereotype about me that I will do anything to dispel. But proceed.
Okay.
I advocate a very non-new agey version of Buddhist philosophy and meditation. But I digress. The stage is yours.
What we are, what I think seeing there is there's a kind of, what is it? There's a kind of cultural, moral, psychic crisis that is affecting the majority of the country, certainly the majority of the white country. And it's bigger. It's obviously not unrelated to economics, but it's bigger than economics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, what do we do about it in the sense that seems to be a real challenge? I mean, I've started this thing called the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which people can subscribe to, by the way, at mindfulresistance.net. But I don't mean mindful in a new agey way, although it's not unrelated to meditation, because I think meditation can make you mindful in the sense that I'm referring to. But my main concern is that the so-called resistance is in some ways too reactive to Trump. They react to things that may or may not be intentional provocations, but sometimes in ways that probably don't help them and may help consolidate his base and so on. What is your take on how the opposition to Trump is conducting itself?
Yeah, well, I don't like the term resistance. I think if you're not in danger of being tortured, if you fall into the hands of the authorities, you shouldn't use that term. And I think it's too dramatic, and it needs to be broader. That the success of constraining Trump is going to depend on the ability to build political forces that stretch from the left wing of the Democratic Party to, include people like, my wife and her friends, who are, classic Republican vote. They own cookware with French words on it. Suburban women who may actually like the tax cut, especially if they don't live in California, but who don't like the manner in which the president conducts his office. And that means a lot of things have to be on the table at the same time. One of the things that you often hear from people on the left is that, and I think they get considerable emotional satisfaction. The Corey Robbins of this world from saying, Trump is so simple, is no different from George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. To which I would say, if you think that, you better hope that that's not true, because George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan kept beating it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, well, what is the kind of let me ask some specific, a more specific version of the question I just asked you. Take the military parade thing. Mm-hmm. Do you think, is that like a trap? You know what I mean? I mean, Trump brings that out, people mock it, and then it looks in middle America like we're mocking the military. On the other hand, I think you'd agree some of the overtones of it you're probably uncomfortable with. You have emphasized in this book and elsewhere your discomfort with the kind of authoritarian overtones, right? Yeah. So what's the proper response to that?
So my reaction to the parade, I have to is politics is local. I'm a District of Columbia taxpayer. I'm not looking forward to having to repave every street in the District of Columbia after you drive tanks over it. So it just seems. I mean, I would feel a lot different if this were a fly past, but the actual parade, it is a bit of. I mean, the parade is also one of those things that irritates everybody who really knows the military, because if you ask any professional soldier what is your least favorite thing about soldiering, they will tell you it's standing at attention, it's ballet. All of this made a lot of sense, in the days when armies fought in lines. But modern armies, these are the skills that are on display in a parade are very useful to warfare in the pre-smokeless powder era, but not very relevant to warfare as it's been conducted since, the First World War. On the other hand, as you say, that's not the right objection. I think the trap of it is this: Donald Trump keeps asserting a claim to the symbols of the republic in a way that is very Republican from Nixon to Reagan, while having these deep and improper connections to a hostile foreign power. So my emotional reaction is the parade is not for you. It's not for you to talk about. And so one of the things I end the book by coming to some things about the Trump era that I think are hopeful, and one of them has been, I think that the smell of disloyalty over the Trump presidency has caused a lot of liberals to rethink their relationship to the American state, to its symbols of patriotism, and to the national security agencies. I talk now a lot more to liberal groups than I used to put it mildly. And one of the things I say to them is, if I were here 4 years ago and I told you that Julian Assange and Edward Snowden were not heroes, I don't know how warm a reception I would have gotten. But today, you see today what I saw 4 years ago, that these are people who are not heroes, and that agencies that protect the country against clandestine threats are just as important as those that protect the country against overt threats. So my response to the parade is not, oh my gosh, this is authoritarian. It's, I think the way I just keep focusing on, take that flag off your lapel, and pin it on the lapel of someone who's got a right to it.
Of course, the response on the left, from some parts of the left, to the phenomenon you just described, which is liberals suddenly being willing to die for the FBI and the CIA or whatever, it's not that they've come to understand something deep. It's just that they're in the throes of tribal psychology. And because Trump is now the enemy of the FBI and Trump is their enemy, well, they are now friends of the FBI.
I've heard that argument. There are people on the left who the only thing they dislike more than Trump is opposition to Trump. And that I've seen this with people. I won't use names, but I'm sure you're familiar with the people I'm talking about. They have this spasm that if anybody criticizes Donald Trump for being too close to Russia, they don't like it. But I think what is going on here, this goes to your point about realignment. I mean, through the Western world, we are seeing that a lot of these distinctions are changing, especially in the face of the Russian involvement with these threats, and that Jeremy Corbyn and Tucker Carlson may have more in common with each other than I feel with either of them.
Right. So Tucker Carlson, a conservative who is seeing eye to eye with Glenn Greenwald on certain, a leftist, obviously, on certain of these issues about the national security state.
And of course, the point of when people say all politics is based on coalitions, to that extent, it's all opportunistic. But one of the things that happens is, if you're someone who takes national security seriously and thinks of Donald Trump as someone who, to some degree, owes his office to a foreign intervention in American politics, all the people who feel that way, whatever their views about the corporate tax cut, discover, hey, we need to work together on this question. And in the same way, all those who say, do not ask the question about Russia, whether it's your Tucker Carlson who wants to defend Trump, or whether you're Glenn Greenwald who wants to attack the agencies that protect us against Russia, they also come together opportunistically. But one of the things, when people come together opportunistically, if it lasts, they begin to develop deep commonality. So I have a question. Julian Assange, who was so long a progressive hero, if you follow his Twitter feed, he sounds identical to the alt-right. And a lot of people on the alt-right, are picking up Greenwald-esque memes about the national security state, and they're sticking together. And I think many of us from the center right who are finding that, are finding that, we're making affinities and relationships that they may also prove lasting.
Well, I think two things. I mean, first of all, I think you'd agree we are not responsible for who picks up our memes. That can't be helped. And secondly, I think you'd agree that somebody like Greenwald has been ideologically consistent. I mean, he was a big critic of the CIA and the FBI before, and he's a critic now, right? I mean,
look, we're not responsible for it, but if I make a joke at a dinner party, and I notice that all the men laugh and none of the women do, that's not my fault exactly. The women were free to laugh, but it shouldn't make me think.
Well, yeah, but it isn't just in this metaphor, it's not just the men who are laughing. I mean, the left, the left hasn't abandoned people like Glenn.
What I mean is, if you say things you always say, and that you believe are right, and you suddenly discover that the Russian state is really excited by what you're doing, you should think about it.
You should quit saying it? Really? No, wait. No, seriously. If you have a deep concern that say your view is, just hypothetically, that the FBI has a history of abusing its power, and I'm sure you'd acknowledge it's done some of that, that the CIA has, and so on, and that's just one of your big driving issues, and then along comes Donald Trump, and you keep saying it. Are you saying that because you get applause from RT, you should quit saying it? If you hold that conviction?
You've used the verb quit, I think, 3 times. I said you should reflect on.
Well, there's probably been reflection, and I think what that's led to is a decision to proceed.
Right. But then you have to you need to think about you do need to think about these things. Again, you're not responsible for who likes your work, of course not. But I think it really does seem to be true that we're living through a time in which let's take something less emotive than the CIA. A question like British departure from the European Union. I know that. I mean, I for 3 years chaired a British think tank. I spent a lot of time over there. I was very active in that debate, and so I can't help noticing that on that one I have a lot more in common with Tony Blair than I do with many of my closest friends in British politics. I think it's a calamity. Most of my friends think it's necessary, and then I notice that then you think, who's on which side of this argument? And what you notice is a lot of the extremist forces in Europe are against the European Union, both on the left and on the right. And what you notice is the non-extremist forces tend to be for it. And you begin to think, well, maybe the issues that are going to be the important issues of the 21st century are going to look different from the issues that were the important issues of the 20th century. And maybe the alignments will be different. I mean, if the question of European Union, yes or no, if for a long time, this is not an American question, but in Europe from 1950 to 1990, the most important question was socialism, yes or no. So all the people said no to socialism for whatever reason were in one party, and all the people said yes or yes maybe or yes with reservations, they were in another. So now they take socialism is dead, and the question is now the European Union, yes or no. That's the number. If that becomes the number one question, we're going to find people on new sides. Right. And in the United States, the question may be, the most important question for a long time was unions or management. That was the defining issue of politics from the war to about 1980. Unions or management. Mm-hmm. And we all answered that question one way or the other. And if it turns out that the new question is authoritarian populism, yes or no, mm-hmm. then a lot of people that we're going to find some people who didn't like unions and people who did like them who hate authoritarian populism will be in one place, and there will be people who say, well, I don't like authoritarian populism, but what I mind even more is the tools necessary to stop it, which do include vigorous national security work against the Russian support. I dislike those tools so much. I will be in the same camp as the people who say they like authoritarian populism, even though I myself am not crazy about it.
Okay, so on this strange bedfellows theme, I mean, you kind of alluded to this a little. This whole Trump thing has put you in bed with some strange fellows, or however you would actually say that. You know, you're you don't like the term resistance, but you're clearly a part of it, and this is kind of part of a larger phenomenon with people, conservatives, and also to some extent, you know, people have been called neoconservatives like you, Bill Kristol, maybe Jennifer Rubin. And I don't know, did you see, I wrote a piece about Bill Kristol on this. I don't know if you saw it. It was,
sorry, I did not.
Oh, well. What it grew out of.
Advance.
What's that?
Send me my homework in advance.
Sorry, but then I wouldn't have an excuse to recap it pithily. No, it just grew out of this suggestion by Ben Wittes at Lawfare that Trump is such a grave national crisis that people who oppose him should call off all criticism, like of each other's ideas, until we get him out of office. I said, this is crazy. Bill Kristol is on foreign policy my nemesis, and I'm not going to. I'm not going to withhold, you know, if he, next time he proposes another war I oppose, I'm not going to hold back. So I said, you know, this is kind of crazy and overdone. And I also, I forget.
I thought the Ben Wittes piece had said, and was, if we're thinking of the same one, it was co-written by Wittes and Jonathan Rauch. And they said you should vote
this was an earlier Ben Wittes piece, but go ahead. I didn't read the one he co-authored with Jonathan Rauch.
Okay, so they said that he said you should vote, that he's going to vote against all Republicans for all offices. So I don't agree with that. I mean, if I lived in the state of California, I would vote mostly for Republicans for state and local office.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because that theme emerged from his first piece. Some people replied and said, well, wait a second, we liberals don't owe anything in any particular allegiance to conservative anti-Trumpers. If anything, they should vow to vote Democratic until we get them out of office or something like that.
Yeah. So let me say this about, I mean, you don't have to like or dislike, you know, there's no point about, I'm not going to make a shidduch between you and Bill Kristol, but.
Wait, what does that term mean?
A shidduch means matchmaking.
Okay.
A contract.
Okay.
But
yeah, I don't think that's going to work out. You're right. Go ahead.
What I'm saying is, I think we are moving into a period, and it was probably predictable when socialism ceased to be the dominant question of politics in Europe, when the status of labor unions ceased to be the dominant question, that it was inevitable that sooner or later you would see the politics begin to move, and that's the nature of political alignments. You know, I think partly because the baby boomers have lived so long in such good health that we have had a frozen party system for a long time. Our present party system was formed by the affiliations of the baby boomers in their late 20s, and then it's continued, and most of them are still now in very healthy 60s, and so it'll probably be with us for a little while longer yet. But it does tend to mean that the things that people form party systems didn't used to be as stable as this, and people moved in and out of the Democratic and Republican parties, and in Europe parties rose and fall because new issues arose. And you know, if you were active in politics in the 1880s or 1890s, one of the things that determined whether you were a Republican or Democrat was how you felt about the control of alcohol. Mm-hmm. And then that issue gets resolved. And then a lot of people who were Republicans, because they felt strongly that alcohol should be illegal, ceased to be Republicans because new issues present themselves. And I think that's something that is going on here. And I think what we are seeing generally is we are having the rise of authoritarian populism as a really powerful force in the world. Has forced people that it's reaffiliated politics, and so and there are people. But as I say, part of it is because authoritarian politics is something that has a major state sponsor in Putin's Russia. If you're concerned about it, among the things you're going to want to do is take seriously the threat from Russia, and that means taking seriously the agencies that defend us from threats like that. And if that's something you cannot do, then yeah, you're going to find yourself drifting into alignment with the people who actually support authoritarian populism. That's just the way politics works. Politics is people. You often find yourself in places where you ask, "How did I get here?" And only.
So you're saying I should embrace Bill Kristol?
No, I'm saying you have to. The theme of the Trump years, that wonderful economist term, revealed preference.
No, actually, what does it mean?
Okay, so you say you like ice cream, you like bananas more than ice cream, but at the checkout counter, I find out what you really mean.
Right.
So
So I say I'm opposed to Trump, but am I willing to embrace Bill Kristol?
You may discover that you're more opposed to Bill Kristol. You may say or let me put this in a way to pick up. You may say you're opposed to Putin, but you dislike the FBI more, and so that is a revealed preference. And I'm not being judgy about it. I'm just saying at this point, I will be judging before and after. I'm not, but it just tells that and politics is all about those things that you are always having to.
I mean, I don't think in either case you wind up with a decision point that's as clear cut as being at the checkout counter and either buying a banana. I mean, it's a pretty hypothetical thing. It's not like I'll have the moment when, gosh, it's either Kristol or Trump, door number 1 or door number 3.
Well, the tragedy of politics is you only know when you had the moment after it's too late.
Well, okay, but what would I do? I don't think we need to go too far. What all I'm saying is like for example, Bill Kristol tweets today, something about the reason we're on the verge of a multi-party war in Syria is because we didn't intervene and I'm tempted to say, wait a second, we did intervene by proxy. We did arm people who turned this into a much bigger mess than it would have been otherwise. I didn't have time. I didn't tweet it. But the point is, I'm not going to refrain because it's so important that I bond with Bill Kristol.
I'm telling you to refrain. I'm talking about that. How are the political coalitions being formed? Mm-hmm. By the way, political coalitions are always full of people who disagree with each other. They also are then in turn driven by factions and personality disputes, and they're always important. And that's why coalitions are inherently unstable, especially two-party coalitions. Years ago, I compared the art of running a party to putting marbles into a bag, assuming the bag was not small, but the problem is the bag was never large enough to hold all the marbles you wanted. Plus, the marbles had minds of their own and kept leaping out of the bag. So coalition management is a very difficult thing. But what is true is, I think, just not just in this country, but throughout the democratic world, that the most important, the number one question defining politics has been changed, mm-hmm. and where people are is changing. And Trump, there are parts of the American left that are finding that they regard Trump as a lesser evil than they regard the CIA or FBI, and that has a real impact on their effective.
Well, I certainly think to get back to Greenwald, I think he has explicitly said that's not the case. That he thinks that Trump is a grave danger. But he's gonna stand by his guns on issues about when searches are and aren't warranted and things like that.
Yeah, but the question is, are you? We are going to have to get to here are some questions that are going to be presented. How important is it to dig to get to the bottom of the Russia inquiry? Mm-hmm. How illegitimate is it to work with the Russians to elect yourself president? I mean, I think I don't think there can be a graver political sin, but other people can think they may not agree. While we're doing this investigation, knowing that the Russians are probably going to try to repeat it again in 2018, what methods do we use? What penalties do we exact from them after it's all proven to be true? There are a whole series of operational questions. And I think one of the things, and I say this to some of my Republican friends who say, if things get really bad, you can count on me. I always say, but the people who say you can count on me at the moment of crisis, I can't count on at the moment of crisis, because by the time the crisis, we won't agree when the crisis is here. When the crisis has come, you will be locked in. There are very few of those big, as you said, there are very few of those bananas versus ice cream moments at the checkout counter. What there are an accumulation of petty decisions that mean people find themselves often in places they didn't intend to go.
Yeah. Let me say one more thing about this issue, the Bill Kristol, Strange Bedfellows issue, and so on. there's a certain amount of, to those of us who care a lot about foreign policy and are, if not the opposite of neoconservative, close, there's some, we view with some concern how Bill Kristol building up like this huge Twitter following by virtue of being part of the resistance. And I mean, you've built up a big following too, but let's use Kristol as the example, because I think he is in some ways.
That's me. No, Bill's not here. Let's talk about me, because Bill's not.
There is a difference, and it's this. It's that there has been particular cynicism on the left about his building up the following, because he was a big proponent of the precursor of Trump, Sarah Palin, which I don't think you were. I don't really remember, but I don't think you were. And B, he has been moving kind of quickly, it seems, to the left on certain issues in what seems like arguably an opportunistic way. And the fear is, just to flesh this out, that then the next war comes, and in fact, it may be coming. I mean, we've got troops in Syria right now, and hell may be breaking loose. And then Bill Kristol will have all these liberal followers who barely or literally don't remember the Iraq War, and he will exert more influence over them than he might otherwise. As I said, that might be true of anyone of his foreign policy persuasion who has built up a big following, as you have. I think there's been more cynicism about him for the reasons I just outlined, but you can talk about either yourself or Kristol.
Look, I think it's not. He's not here to speak for himself.
He's welcome, by the way. I would love to talk to him. I fear that he is not interested.
Okay, but I'm not going to talk about him, because it is talking about someone behind their back, and especially since you have so much animus against him.
Wait, me?
Yes.
Animus?
Yes.
I think you're getting me mixed up with someone less enlightened.
No,
who doesn't meditate.
It may be at a higher astral plane, but yeah, there's a lot of animus.
That is where my animus is. Yes.
Here's what I would say, and because I get this question asked of me a lot, which is, I was for the Iraq War. I still find it a very complicated decision, and my position in Iraq was, if I knew then exactly what I wouldn't know. What I know now, there were no weapons of mass destruction, I would not have been for it. On the other hand, I could easily, if my present self, all those years older, were back in 2003 with the information at my disposal, I probably would support it on the basis of the information I had. So, it remains to my mind a very difficult question what was the right thing to do. So people say to me, okay, so that's, and I'm very conservative on all kinds of other issues. And people say, given that that's true, why should I listen to you? I always say that's not my problem. That's not a question to ask to me. I write. I present information. I present arguments. You decide what to do with it. And you don't want to listen to it? Fine. And you want to listen to some of it and not others? Also fine. Complicated, but fine too. But what I would say is understand the dynamism of politics, and understand that the dynamism is actually quite serious. It is a real thing. It's not a matter of opportunism. So, for example, real world, we're thinking about this just this week because of these terrible stories in the White House. So supposing you're somebody who tends to take a conservative view of gender relations, thinks, feminists, they kind of overdo it. Basically things are working out. Get the institution of marriage working out. Yeah, there's some abuse, obviously, and it's terrible when it happens, but it's not important. It's not defining. I think, and people talk about it too much. I think that would be not a too unfair cartoon of a lot of the conservative view of these issues pre-Donald Trump. Then Donald Trump takes the most brutal kind of male dominance, and he puts it on a jumbotron, times 1,000,000 in the middle of the public square. And he fills his White House with people who literally beat people they love or claim to love. And then he says, now everybody look at this. Here it is, times 1,000,000. What do you think? I hate him. I hate this. I don't like any of it. And they then people find themselves on journeys that take them to new places because they've had to confront something. And they're suddenly in dialogue with people who are they're in disagreement with, but who are political partners. They're in dialogue, and the dialogue changes people. Just as I think it changes you to go on Tucker Carlson's show. I think it changes you to talk to people who, say, well, you don't like you don't like it that they hit their wives, but that the hitting didn't come out of nowhere. What about 15 minutes before the hitting? How do you feel about this? You make a point. So these things are dynamic. Politics is about change. This has always been. If I look back over all of my writing, one of the master themes of my life has been that they keep changing the questions. And if you don't change with the questions, then you're not being of any use to anybody, including yourself, because your answers. One of my favorite political jokes. This is a long speech. I'm sorry. I'll end with this joke. So William O'Neill, who is one of the founders of the American Communist Party, left the party in the 1950s, and maybe even earlier. He broke with the party and became then a conventional Cold War liberal. And he was at a dinner party in about 1960. And he met the young Kenneth Tynan, who was then just down from Cambridge, famous theater critic, full of Marxist enthusiasm. And Tynan began to lecture William O'Neill about the necessity for communist revolution, to which O'Neill replied, "Your answers are so old that I have forgotten the questions." You don't want to be Kenneth Tynan.
Okay, and you're not in danger of that.
I'm in danger of the opposite. Maybe that's one of my things about conservatives.
What would the current? What is this example of the opposite? What would that literally be in your case?
My friends say that I'm so attuned to the danger of the moment that I don't adhere sufficiently to the timeless principles of conservatism. To which I say, I don't believe the principles of conservatism are timeless. I believe that what you, my fellow conservatives, call conservatism are mostly a set of congealed answers to the problems of the 1960s and 70s. And when they took the problems away, that the answers ceased to be very relevant. I had this on hand. It's not a regular recipient of mail from David Koch, but
hey, could you give me his email address?
No, it's just got his head. And an opportunity, an invitation to send him some money. But
wait a second, there's something wrong with this picture. David Koch wants you to send him money.
He wants me to send him money, yes. But he'll take as little as $100, which I think is actually very democratic of him. But so here's something in this letter. It's a long letter, very long. They got a bad job from their fundraising agency, but he tells us that the country is in urgent danger, and he says, and this danger is true. This is true even in the face of the enactment of tax reform and other strong efforts that I enthusiastically support by President Trump and some in Congress. There is a very dangerous tidal wave sweeping the nation, and it was symbolized by the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. Honestly, I don't love Bernie Sanders. I don't think Bernie Sanders should be president. I don't agree with very much. But Bernie Sanders, who's now the senator from Vermont and the runner-up in the defeated party, like that, and while we enthusiastically support President Trump, like I'm supposed to take that seriously?
And you would probably rather Sanders be president, right?
Than Donald Trump? Yeah, I'd rather Sanders be president.
Do you think he could have won? I think he would have won.
No, don't think so. Martin O'Malley would have won.
Ugh. The Maryland governor?
Yeah.
Oh, man. We needn't get into this.
Here's why. President Obama had a 53% approval rate going into the election. Yeah. Personal income growth was personal incomes were rising. Political scientists tell you the party of the president should have won. Mm-hmm. So what you want to do is you want to find the most, in that section, find the most generic Democrat you can. Actually, if he didn't have a name, it would be even more perfect. So what happened with Hillary Clinton
would be in keeping with the rest of him too. But go ahead.
Okay, but Hillary Clinton ran 5 points behind the generic Democrat, that was the problem. That a generic Democrat would have won that race.
You know, one thing I have discovered, and I have 3 siblings. 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. Did you know that, David?
I did not.
Fascinating,
Why?
Isn't it? I come from the real America, dude.
You're bearing the lead. Why?
Well, this gets, I mean, different reasons. This is the first thing to note is there is no one Trump voter, and there is, you know, but among the themes that emerge, and I think this is no secret, is just intense dislike for Hillary, which in the case I'm thinking about in my family, I don't want to name different siblings, but in the case I'm thinking about, it actually originates in dislike of Bill. It goes back to that. It's just dislike of Clinton that maybe has some special features associated with Hillary, but it's intense. And that was no small factor. Just sentiment about the Clintons and Hillary as people. You haven't gotten that vibe?
Oh yeah, but look, I think Hillary underperformed, but I think Sanders would have underperformed for other reasons. Mm-hmm. What you need, by the way, the gender gap against in the Democratic primaries of men voting for Sanders and women voting for Hillary Clinton was even more extreme than in the general election. And of course, Sanders radically underperformed with minority candidates. But a generic, run-of-the-mill, no distinguishing characteristics Democrat, I think, would have won that election.
Okay. Now, David, you've shown admirable self-restraint in not repeatedly, forcefully steering this conversation back to the subject of your book, per se. So let's talk a little about your book, per se. Mm-hmm. Trumpocracy, one virtue of a title like that is it forces just about any interviewer to say, to mention the word of the title in the course of asking you exactly what you mean by it. Mm-hmm. What is Trumpocracy? Trumpocracy
is a system of power. And the core argument of the book is, while I'm as fascinated as anybody with the lurid revelations of Michael Wolff, that if you focus too tightly on the personality of Donald Trump, you miss the story. Because the danger that Trump presents is a danger within the context of a modern bureaucratic state, where where the president works in tandem with others. And the essence of the way Donald Trump governs is that he has corrupted, hence the subtitle, a lot of other institutions to enabling his power. Not that he's got just so much that he wants to do, but more his power that he needs protection. That Donald Trump has got a lot of risks, legal, national security risks. The normal agencies of government would catch him, so he needs to basically shut off all the burglar alarms of the American state in order to get away with what he's up to.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's a blessing that he's not more competent? I mean, he's a little ham-handed about a lot of this stuff. And it's hard to tell when it's intentional, but surely you can imagine a smoother version of him.
You can, but it's also important not to underestimate him. Because he's so incompetent at the things a president should do, do not underestimate his wiliness at the things a president should not do. So, he has and even many of the things that look incompetent actually have been, I think, usually through dumb luck, helpful to him. Like the chaos in the White House has created a news story in which no one scandal ever predominates because there's so much. I think the thing that is striking about the Rob Porter abuse of his wife story is we've been talking about it for 5 days. I can't remember the last time we talked about any heinous thing from the Trump White House for as long as that.
Yeah, and that raises the question of the closely related question of would Trump, and to me the perennial question is crazy or crazy like a fox. He'll do this stuff and your first reaction is, this is nuts, he's out of control, and then you start thinking about ways he may be playing to his base. And after the Porter thing, he did this tweet about how men's lives are being ruined and blah, blah, blah. And it was a pretty carefully constructed tweet.
Yeah. Trump never has a plan, in my opinion.
You think he never has a plan? You don't think he's even thinking, wait, I know there's a lot of people who voted for me who agree that the Me Too thing has gotten out of hand. You don't think he's even thinking that far?
I don't think he works that way. What he has is he's a force of pure anger and a force of pure will to power. And the reason he is so effective is he just is the resentment that a lot of the traditional that older white men have, and he had, I mean, it's sort of amazing. Like, I'm not a wealthy man like Donald Trump. I don't have my name on a tower in New York, but I'm more successful than most people. I'm in the upper echelon of American society, and frankly, I'm pretty content with my life. I could not canalize that kind of anger.
And by the way, Frum Tower has a good ring to it. I wouldn't rule it out. You're young enough to make that happen before you.
But there is something. I mean, he's got the rage that is so integral to a big part of his audience. He's authentically got it. And the second thing he's got this brutish will to power that bends people. Like people, H.R. McMaster, General Kelly. I mean, some of the most powerful personalities in American life. He bends them, and even people like Rex Tillerson, who didn't get bent, nonetheless do submit. There's a kind of primal force there. So he doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a strategy. He may sometimes have tactics. But when he ventilates, as he's done in this wife abuse story, he is showing you something authentic. And that's a big part of his power. This is not a plan. This is an authentic expression of something that connects to wide sections of American society.
Mm-hmm. So you got the book written in admirably brisk fashion. And it's impressive. I mean, how long did it? When did you start working on it?
Depends what counts as work. I wrote it over the period from June the 30th to the middle of September, but the material in it has been accumulating intensely since 2014, and to a lesser degree since 2007.
Because it's not that short a book. It's hard for me to tell because I was listening to the audio book, but it's how many words is it?
It's about 85,000 words.
Yeah, that's not tiny.
And then it's got a lot of footnotes.
Yeah.
But so the footnote material all refers. So I've been at this stand for a long time. I mean, I've been worried about the crisis of the American middle class very intensely since my 2007 book, and I've been writing about authoritarian populism and its risk, and that the United States wouldn't be immune. Although I didn't foresee Donald Trump specifically since 2014. I read an article about this topic in Foreign Affairs in 2014. Mm-hmm.
But you saw something like this coming.
Yeah. I didn't. I have to admit, I didn't think it would be successful. We had this conversation on the first day of January 2015. Mm-hmm. I would say these are really powerful forces, and Jeb Bush won't be able to control them, and they will be. He will discover that he can't run the Republican Party the way he wants to because these forces will get so. And nor should one assume they will only be in the Republican Party. They may show up inside the Democratic Party. Yada yada yada. But what I did not imagine is they would actually be strong enough to take control of the party and then win an election.
It was an amazing thing, I have to admit.
And that's kind of a lucky bounce for them. But the thing to bear in mind is because both of those victories were kind of flukish, it's pretty easy to imagine them being undone. It's pretty easy for me to imagine Donald Trump losing the 2020 election, at which point a lot of people will say problem solved. And what I think we're in danger of saying is Trump overperformed his social forces in 2016. He may underperform in 2020, but that's why I want to emphasize the Trumpocracy, not just Donald Trump, because his election and his defeat, should that happen, will not be the end of what is going on in the society, and not just in this society, but in Europe too.
Mm-hmm. Final question on foreign policy: has he been less to your dislike than one might have imagined during the campaign? And by that I mean, I guess they're sending anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainian government, which you wouldn't have guessed. They are, there was the airstrike in the wake of the chemical weapons attack in Syria. We've now got troops in Syria in support of Kurds, apparently. He's been pro-Israel to what I think even a lot of pro-Israel people would say is almost literally a fault, right? I mean, there's a number of pro-Israel people who think moving the embassy is a mistake. But in any event, my point is you would not have predicted that from the early rhetoric. You wouldn't have predicted any of this from the early rhetoric. Are you feeling at all better about his foreign policy, or? No,
I feel I think foreign policy is actually the area of greatest damage. My concern is always, and this is, I think, the longest, most consistent political theme of my life, has been to preserve the U.S.-led world order and the U.S.-led alliance system. That inevitably was going to get harder and harder and harder as the United States and its friends, as our share of the world economy shrank. I made this point in the 2007 book that as I said, you're one of three people to read. That in 1980,
people who interviewed you about it. Don't sell yourself short. There could have been 4 to 5 readers.
But in 2007, the United States plus the NATO countries plus Japan plus a few others added up to 1985, that group of countries produced half of the planet's output. On the track we're on, by 2025, they'll produce under a third of the planet's output. And we've been reinforced by Central Europe since then. So that objectively, the power of the global democratic alliance is less. And the pressures on individual members of it, like South Korea, are greater. Holding that together, making it work, was going to be challenging for whoever, for even the most tactful person. So what Trump is doing is he's dissolving it from within, and that, I'm happy sending anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Although, given the levels of corruption in Ukraine, if you only send the missiles and don't send the trainers, you're very likely putting the missiles into the black market. That is a real problem. You need a much more cohesive and integrated involvement with Ukrainian art, and that Trump does, because he does these things on the cheap, he actually can make the problem worse, and there is a real risk that weapons will be sold. Same thing with the bombing, with the airstrike to Syria. You have, if you want to intervene in this, that takes a giant effort, including building someone who can govern Syria, not just firing missiles into the void. But our alliance structures are weaker, and the strategic calamity of what is happening between Britain and the EU. Look, I'm happy the embassy is in Jerusalem. Terrific. The fact that we are heading toward a breakdown in the relationship between Britain and Germany is a lot more important. That's something that's like the most cherished heirloom we were handed down by our grandparents after 1945, as they built real, meaningful friendship, not just an alliance, friendship between France and Britain and Germany. And it's dissolving in front of our eyes, and America is not there. I mean, the number one foreign policy problem handled Donald Trump, and whoever was. You can't literally do it like this, but basically, concept: get the German Chancellor and the British Prime Minister to Camp David. So we are not leaving until we don't care what it is. By the way, any deal that you sign that leaves you rising as friends is good with us, but there will be a deal, and it has to be amicable, and it has to be final, and it has to be fast. And the United States is completely AWOL from that.
Okay, well, thank you, David. The book is Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. It's only been out a few weeks, and it has definitely not been overtaken by events. The Trump you describe is very much, for better or worse, and I think what I mean is for worse, the Trump that we still have in the White House. So continue good luck with the book.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks for the conversation.
Thank you, Bob. Bye-bye.